Okay, here we're going to be looking at a few key components of connecting cycles and spheres of the Earth. You can see two of your I can statements involve this. This is basically saying connect all cycles to the sphere of the Earth, and this is saying make sure you can connect the water cycle to those spheres of the Earth. So we're going to start with an introduction project here that will take you through lots of different video clips and ask you some key questions that will hopefully get you thinking about the right things. So let's get started. First, we're going to look at a quick summary of what the main spheres of the Earth are. We have the lithosphere, which is all solid Earth. This involves rocks, dirt, all that good stuff. We have the hydrosphere, which is all the water that is found on Earth, lakes, rivers, streams, creeks. We have the atmosphere, which are the gases that surround our planet, mostly nitrogen and oxygen, but this is a thin layer of gas all the way around our planet. And then the biosphere, which involves all life on planet Earth, from the tiniest living things, tiny bacteria, all the way up to some of the largest things that we can think of, elephants, whales, whatever. Any life on Earth is a part of the biosphere. So those are the spheres, and I'm going to be using those terms a lot here. First cycle I want to look at is the water cycle. The water cycle involves all the spheres of the Earth. We have the hydrosphere is involved with lakes, like freshwater things, creeks, rivers, streams, also oceans. So as a part of this, a lot of our water is stored in the hydrosphere. It can interact with the atmosphere after it evaporates in the water cycle. So the sun beats down, excites the molecules, they vibrate, they're faster. Energy allows them to change state from liquid to gas. And once they're gas there, water vapor in the atmosphere. Okay, in the atmosphere, usually they cool down before they get to the top of the troposphere, one of the lower layers of the atmosphere. And they cool, condense, turn into a liquid. A lot of times they even freeze, but eventually they always fall back down. So we call this precipitation. So water spent in the atmosphere is really spent as water vapor. Once it falls back down, there's a lot of stuff that could happen. It usually will interact with the lithosphere in some way. So we can have that happening as water becomes a part of the groundwater. It can also cause erosion of the lithosphere, making new soil and all that good stuff. Usually, we will end up being collected in a stream, lake, creek, underground reservoir, something like that. And eventually it can make its way back to plants and animals. So plants utilize water, obviously, from the lithosphere. They pull water out of the soil. And animals utilize water as well, and we're familiar with that, so I don't need to beat a dead horse. That is the main concept of how the water cycle interacts with those spheres of the Earth. So the biosphere is where the plants and animals are. Anytime water is interacting with the soil, we would say it's involved with the lithosphere. Water as a gas is typically in the atmosphere. And water in lakes, rivers, streams, creeks, and oceans, that would be water in the hydrosphere. Moving on. The carbon cycle is our next cycle we're going to look at. A brief introduction to the carbon cycle. You need to know that carbon is an element and that carbon is vital for life on Earth. We're going to start off with the CO2, the carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere. In the atmosphere, carbon pretty much only exists as a couple different types of gases, and the most common is CO2. CO2 is used by plants to create sugars, so CO2 is part of the recipe for photosynthesis. CO2 ends up being combined with H2O, and it leads to simple sugars. The formula for that is C6H12O6, but you just need to remember that carbon that was a gas gets turned into sugars, essentially, or gets converted into sugars. Once a sugar, plants can utilize this to help them live, which is why they make it. They don't make it for us. Animals oftentimes will steal the sugars from those plants and utilize them for food as well. When these things die, carbon is returned back to our soil as waste. A lot of times, the waste products will remain in the soil for a long period of time, and under great pressure and time, you will form fossil fuels. Okay, so one of the main storage areas for carbon in the past has been fossil fuels, just kind of stored in the lithosphere as a fossil fuel. Only recently have we been kind of altering that, and we take carbon out of the ground, we dig it up as coal, or we pump it up as oil, and we burn it. So we are artificially taking carbon that was stored in the lithosphere and pumping it back into our atmosphere. This is our carbon cycle in general. The only thing I really left out is the fact that when we undergo respiration, so when animals use sugar for energy, one of the waste products is CO2. So every time you exhale, you're actually taking some of the carbon that was in that sugar you ate and exhaling it back out as carbon dioxide. Very fun process. So that is a brief rundown of the carbon cycle. The last cycle we're going to look at is nitrogen. Nitrogen is also an element just like carbon, and it's also vital for life on Earth. It is not needed to make sugars. However, it is needed to make a lot of the complex proteins that act as, you could say, maybe the Legos that our body are made of. You need it for your cells to be created. So these proteins would be impossible if we were breathing in atmospheric nitrogen. We breathe in nitrogen on a regular basis, but the nitrogen itself is unable to be processed by our bodies. In order to do that, we need special plants we call legumes. Legumes are bean plants. And in the roots here, there's a special type of bacteria that can take nitrogen from the atmosphere, bring it into the biosphere, which is a big first step. Without these legumes, there would be no productive way to bring nitrogen into the other spheres of the Earth. It would just hang out in the atmosphere as an inert gas that is pretty much useless. So these bean plants bring it in. There are a lot of processes that take place there. It could be consumed by animals, and animals could get it from eating these beanie plants. Or something else happens. That nitrogen could be broken down by several different types of bacteria. So we have a few phases here. We have the bacteria and the legumes, and then two different types of soil bacteria that eventually take it from being useless to useful. Once it has gone through these steps of ammonification and nitrification in these two types of bacteria, it is forming nitrates, which you can think of as fertilizers. These are the things that the plants use to grow, and when we eat the plants, we get these things as well. Now, if a plant or a bunny or any living thing with nitrogen in it dies, decomposers break it down, turn it back into ammonia, and it starts the process over again. Last thing that I haven't mentioned yet, there's one more thing within the biosphere that interacts with this in the soil, and that's called denitrifying bacteria. And this little type of bacteria can take nitrogen that's useful and make it unuseful. How dare they? But they put nitrogen back into the atmosphere. Again, this is a cycle, so it continues in a variety of different ways, and nitrogen travels in many different pathways through the different spheres of our Earth. You're going to be watching several videos here in a second. I hope that you can follow along. Try to make connections between the cycles and the spheres of the Earth. Have fun.
Alright, we're talking about the four spheres of the Earth today. In this tutorial, we're going to talk about the atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, and biosphere. Let's talk about the atmosphere first. The atmosphere is basically all the gases surrounding the Earth. So when I talk about that, I mean, okay, here's a nice picture of the Earth from space. There's the surface of the Earth all the way up to this point where you can't really see anything anymore. And that's the atmosphere. Okay? Gases that we can't normally see. The atmosphere is where weather happens. Whenever we have storms or rain or anything, the atmosphere is where this is occurring in. Wind currents are a big deal with the atmosphere because they transport things like clouds a long distance. Okay, if we didn't have that, then most of the Earth would be a desert. Since we're talking about a little bit of that, the atmosphere spreads that water through the water cycle. We remember that the water cycle is basically the sun's rays pounding the Earth with energy, making things hot. When water in its liquid form is heated up, whether it's in the soil, in oceans, or in lakes, it will tend to rise. That is called evaporation. Once that water vapor rises up into the atmosphere high enough, it'll start to condense into clouds, and as that condensation increases, pretty soon you have a nice a big cloud here, and that water vapor will return to its liquid form in the form of precipitation, which will be rain, snow, sleet, or hail. All right, let's talk about the hydrosphere now. It's all the water in the world, all of it. I mean rivers, I mean lakes, I mean oceans. Now, the big deal with that is that we have ocean currents as well. Ocean currents will transport warm and cool water all around the globe. It's basically the heating and cooling system of the Earth. Let me get back down to here. All right, now the water cycle is also not just how water is transported, but how the hydrosphere changes. Okay, in oceans and lakes, it's liquid. As it evaporates, it is gas. As it condenses, it turns back into its liquid form. All right, now that we have that all over with, let's talk about the lithosphere. Lithosphere, it's the Earth's crust. It's what we walk on. It's what our rocks are made of and stuff. So we can see the lithosphere is this tiny little skin that surrounds the Earth, kind of like an apple. Has a thin layer of skin, but all this kind of crazy, good-looking stuff inside here. All this is inside the Earth. This would be liquid hot magma. Don't touch this. Tectonic plates are a part of the lithosphere. They create mountains, valleys, volcanoes, even oceans. When those tectonic plates separate, they create oceans. Wow, isn't that cool? Okay, now another important thing about the lithosphere is that over time, the rocks that are a part of the lithosphere can be turned into soil. We have weathering processes, such as rain falling down on this big rock, wind blowing this rock around, maybe freezing and thawing forces. All of those will separate little bits and pieces of this rock at a time. And we can see down here at the bottom of it, those little bits and pieces of rock have deposited at the bottom. This will be eventually turned into soil. All right. Erosion over time turns rocks into soil. Now, the biosphere. Since we're talking about biosphere, soil, let's transition right into plants and animals. Biosphere is all the plants and animals in the world. All these different plants, all these different animals, and of course we see as a wonderful backdrop the soil, which we just talked about as the lithosphere. Okay, that's how these things are kind of connected. The soil in the lithosphere brings forth life in the form of plants, which also allows animals to exist. And then you have there are forces such as the atmosphere and hydrosphere, all interacting to bring life to this Earth. Oh, how nice. Okay, that's the 4 spheres.
All the water on Earth today, every drop, is all the water there has ever been on the planet. Fresh water is actually millions of years old, the same water flowing in a continuous loop, falling as rain and snow from clouds to the Earth's surface, running in rivers, pooling in ponds, flowing from faucets, irrigating crops, traveling through plants, generating power, eventually evaporating into the air and condensing into clouds again.
Why is there life on Earth? And the reason there's life on Earth is because Earth has this perfect water cycle.
The water cycle. So simple even small children understand the basics. Yet so complex the most advanced Earth scientists, hydrologists, geologists, and biogeochemists are studying every part and process.
The water cycle is fascinating. It's something that's around us all the time, and yet we don't really understand it.
How to summarize what is known about the water cycle? With 2 words, flows and stores. The water cycle is a series of flows of water between various water stores or storages. Clouds in the atmosphere.
There's always a little bit of water in the atmosphere. We talk about relative humidity. It's a humid day, it's a dry day. Either way, there's water, sometimes a little, sometimes a lot.
There's a lot of water in the ocean, 70% of all the water on Earth. In the ice sheets and glaciers, 2/3 of all the fresh water on Earth. In the snowpacks atop mountains like the Sierra Nevada. In the Great Lakes, in rivers and streams, in reservoirs and watersheds, in wetlands, in the soil, in and on plants and trees rooted in the soil, and beneath the soil, in water tables and underground aquifers like the Ogallala High Plains, which runs underneath parts of 8 states from South Dakota to Texas. All this storage is temporary. Water in all its forms is always in flux and always moving. And there is a name for every kind of movement in the water cycle, starting with precipitation.
Precipitation is the process of water falling onto the surface of the earth. You can have precipitation in many forms: rain, snow, hail.
Rain is falling water in liquid form. Snow, ice, hail, and sleet are falling water in solid or frozen form. Fog and mist, falling water in gas or vapor form. Precipitation that falls directly onto the oceans becomes part of surface ocean and can be churned by wave and wind action into ocean currents. Rain and snow that falls directly on rivers and streams becomes one part of stream flow. Rain that falls onto land takes a different path to the river, as does the snow and ice that falls and collects on mountaintops when temperatures warm.
When snow melts, some of it runs through the snowpack and goes into small streams, tributaries that feed into large rivers.
What about that precipitation that falls on and over land? Some is intercepted by vegetation, plants, and trees.
Like you might imagine someone in the game of football intercepting a pass. These are raindrops trying to come to the ground, and the leaves on the tree intercept them before they hit the ground.
And the precipitation that does hit the ground, it can run off if the ground is hardscaped, covered with asphalt or concrete, or if the soil is too wet or saturated to absorb more water, like an over-soaked sponge. Otherwise, precipitation infiltrates the soil surface, percolates into the ground.
Think of it as the water percolating through your coffee grounds in the morning. Gravity continues to pull it downward so it will move through.
Through the topsoil, into spaces between soil and rock particles, down to bedrock and further into fractures, into deep underground aquifers. Even groundwater here is moving sideways or laterally, discharging toward a river, lake, or the sea. Generally, the deeper the flow, the slower the flow.
Some of that fractured water might take a very long time, thousands to millions of years to get out.
And how does water get back out into the atmosphere? It evaporates, is turned from a liquid into a gas or vapor by the heat of the sun.
If you put a bit of water into a bowl and you set it outside on a sunny day, it's going to disappear. It's still water, it's just in the form of a gas rather than the form of a liquid.
Water evaporates from every wet surface, even from wet air. Some rain and snow evaporates into the air while falling. Water evaporates through our respiration and perspiration, and from plants through transpiration. Trans means through or across. Plant roots draw up groundwater.
And plants pull that water up through their stems into their leaves and then release it back out through evapotranspiration.
Evapotranspiration, a spelling bee-worthy term for evaporation from soil and water surfaces plus transpiration from plants. Evaporated water molecules are tiny enough to flow into the air, mix with smoke and dirt particles in the atmosphere, cool, condense into visible masses of water vapor, clouds. Winds move clouds into colder air, water droplets collide and merge, grow bigger and heavier until they are so heavy they fall again, as rain or snow, sleet or hail. Precipitation, collection, runoff, interception, infiltration, percolation, discharge, transpiration, evaporation, condensation. the water cycle.
Do you know why you're laughing so much? It's because of a gas, nitrous oxide. It is also called laughing gas. This is what made you laugh. Let me tell you, laughing gas is made of nitrogen and oxygen. Do you know that most of the air you breathe is nitrogen? Oh, you can breathe this nitrogen. It is not laughing gas. In fact, although the air around us is full of nitrogen, we can't use it directly. To get it into our bodies, nitrogen has to go through a nitrogen cycle. Understand? Okay, I'll tell you more about nitrogen. But let's go to the kitchen. I'm baking a cake there. The cake isn't ready yet. We have to bake it first so that we can eat it. Nitrogen is just like this cake. Before we can use it, it needs to turn into other compounds. Did you know all living things need nitrogen to live? All of us, plants, animals, and humans, need nitrogen to make the proteins in our body. Plants also need it to make chlorophyll, the stuff that makes them green and helps them make food from sunlight. You really are hungry. But you gotta wait for the cake to bake. Just like nitrogen, which must be fixed for the plants to use. Lightning and some bacteria that live in some plants can fix the nitrogen in air for us to use. This is called nitrogen fixation. Not this plant. Special plants, called legume plants, have this bacteria in their roots. For example, soybean plants help fix the nitrogen. The bacteria in soil turns nitrogen into ammonia and nitrates, which plants can then use to grow. Now you know how plants get their nitrogen. Can you guess how animals get their nitrogen? Yes, by eating plants. Animals get their nitrogen from the plants. Are you wondering about the nitrogen going inside your body? It comes back to the soil through the waste animals produce. Yes, like this waste, animals also make waste. All that goes back to soil. When they die and their bodies decompose, the nitrogen again goes back to the soil for the plants to use. So tell me, what is nitrogen? Great. Do we need nitrogen? Superb! And how do we get that nitrogen? Wonderful. You have understood how we take in the atmospheric nitrogen. You now know how nitrogen in air is fixed so that all living things can use it. Do you want to know how this nitrogen goes back to the air? Some other bacteria do this work. They change ammonia and nitrate back to nitrogen, so the nitrogen cycle can be completed. This is just like the nitrogen cycle. Round and round and round, in the air, in the soil, in the plants, in the animals, in the soils, and back to the air.
The Earth is continuously bombarded with energy from the sun and radiates most of that energy as heat back into space, making Earth's biosphere an open system in terms of energy. In contrast, the Earth's biosphere is primarily a closed system in terms of water, minerals, and nutrients. There are finite amounts of these substances, which are recycled through the living and geological components of the biosphere, called a biogeochemical cycle. Carbon, a key element of organic life on Earth, cycles through the biosphere in this way. A tree, like all plants, algae, and cyanobacteria, is an autotroph, an organism that produces its own food from inorganic molecules to facilitate growth. Through photosynthesis, photosynthetic autotrophs use energy from the sun to combine carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water from the soil to form carbohydrates such as glucose. Oxygen is released as a byproduct of photosynthesis. This is where we will start to track the passage of carbon through the carbon cycle. When sunlight strikes a leaf, the energy in the sunlight is captured and used to convert 6 molecules of carbon dioxide gas from the atmosphere into the 6-carbon sugar, glucose, which can be used as a source of energy for cellular reactions. Glucose can then be stored as starch to be used later for energy, or used to make other molecules, such as cellulose, that form the cell wall of plant cells and contribute to the biomass of the plant. Cellulose is one of the substances aiding in the rigid nature of many plant structures, like the leaves, branches, stems, and trunk. When a log or other portion of a tree is burned, the stored glucose is converted by oxidation back to carbon dioxide gas, which is released into the atmosphere. In a similar way, the burning of fossil fuels, which contain carbon that was sequestered in prehistoric decomposing plant and animal tissues and buried for millions of years, releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Animals are not autotrophs, but heterotrophs. Because heterotrophs depend on the carbon cycle to obtain energy and molecules necessary for growth, they need to consume other organisms. They do this by eating plants, or by eating other animals that eat plants. The glucose a deer acquires from eating plants contains carbon that the plant converted from carbon dioxide gas during photosynthesis. The process of converting glucose to energy, a process called oxidative respiration, uses oxygen to break down glucose molecules in cells, ultimately producing ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the energy of most cellular reactions. Carbon dioxide, generated as a waste product of the metabolic oxidation of glucose, is released into the atmosphere. Through the same process of oxidative respiration, plants also release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This occurs predominantly at night when they are not using carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. In addition to emitting carbon dioxide through oxidative respiration, animals release some carbon as solid waste. These solid waste products are broken down in the soil by decomposers, saprobes, and detritivores, organisms such as bacteria and fungi that degrade the waste to remove recyclable nutrients that they use for energy and growth. In the process of breaking down animal feces, decaying plants, and dead animals, decomposers also release carbon dioxide gas into the atmosphere. Carbon cycles in a similar way through aquatic ecosystems. Carbon is present in water as dissolved carbon dioxide and bicarbonate ions. Both are sources of carbon for photosynthesis and are taken up by algae and aquatic plants. Carbon dioxide is released into the water through oxidative respiration in these organisms and in other aquatic organisms such as fish, and in decomposition. Carbon dioxide is also exchanged between the water and the atmosphere. The constant absorption of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by photosynthetic organisms and its conversion to carbohydrates by photosynthesis is key to sequestering carbon in the biotic environment. The breakdown of glucose by respiration or burning converts the carbon back to carbon dioxide, releasing it back into the atmosphere. These two processes contribute to the carbon cycle. Because there is a finite amount of carbon in the Earth's biosphere, nutrient cycling such as this is essential to life on Earth. When viewed as a biogeochemical cycle, one can see how the carbon cycle is a balance of carbon stores in the atmosphere, in the bodies of living organisms, and buried in the ground as fossil fuels. Maintaining this cycle in the closed system of the Earth's biosphere allows organisms to live on Earth, and participate as key players in the carbon cycle.